Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, most people would probably like to know how much their boss earns compared to them. Well, later today, the government could be about to unveil proposals that would force companies to reveal how much more those at the top are paid than the average member of staff. They're part of a crackdown on fat cats creaming off excessive profits. But critics say it could make business less competitive and make it harder to hold on to top executive talent. The Business Secretary, Greg Clark, says the government has three key plans.
One is to have greater shareholder scrutiny of and determination of senior executive pay, which has risen beyond the performance of companies. Second is to have a greater voice for workers and other stakeholder groups in the boardroom over executives. And the third is to consider whether the largest private businesses that employ a lot of people but are not listed on the stock market should be part of a more rigorous set of standards that public companies are held to.
Well, let's talk to Francis O'Grady, General Secretary of the Trade Union Congress, who says Theresa May must stand up to the elites with these measures. Tom Gosling is a partner at the management consultants PricewaterhouseCoopers, where he advises some of the UK's biggest companies on their executives' pay and perks. Andy Sylvester is from the Institute of Directors. He says recent scandals like the collapse of BHS mean big companies must improve the way they operate. And we're also joined from West Sussex by John O'Donoghue, a business development director at Software Planet Group. He supports the government plan and says fair pay and transparency make companies more flexible. Thank you all very much for joining us. Francis O'Grady, from what you've heard from the government, is it going as far as you had hoped?
Well, we've got a green paper today, but we had a promise from the Prime Minister in the House of Commons that she would stick to her plans and stick to her promise to have workers elected onto boards. And I think that's important, not just because of fairness and fair pay, but because all the evidence is from other countries that do have workers on boards. Companies are much more likely to invest in R&D, in skills, and focus on the long term, which of course workers have a big interest in the long-term success of their companies. So,
Tom Gosling, what do you think then about workers on boards? Would it be a good thing?
I think it will be a good thing for some companies, and I think I have no objection to workers on boards as a principle. I think the question is whether the evidence is sufficiently overwhelming that it's right for all companies in all circumstances. So I would favour an approach that actually encourages greater employee voice amongst other stakeholders into the boardroom. Boards, after all, have an obligation to take into account the views of all stakeholders, but to allow different models to evolve rather than a one-size-fits-all.
When you look at the way pay has changed in recent years, particularly focusing on FTSE 100 companies. In 2010, the average FTSE 100 boss earned 89 times the average salary. By 2015, it had gone up to 123 times the average salary. Clearly, something isn't keeping pay in check. So what would you identify as what has been going on?
Well, so I think the government is actually focusing on the right broad areas here, which is getting the right shareholder powers, getting transparency around pay and how CEOs are paid, and also making sure that pay plans are focused on the long term and really aligned with the creation of long-term value. It's essential for business, I think, to connect better on this question of fairness. There's absolutely no doubt about that. So in work that I've been doing with the big innovation company, a report published last Friday, we think the right way to do that is actually through a fair pay charter that incorporates a whole range of dimensions around fair pay and which companies should be required to engage on with employees. We think that will create more change in behaviour.
I think think the problem is voluntary charters and no sanctions brings no change at all. In terms of shareholders, we've had, out of thousands of companies, just 3 successful rebellions against top pay in the last year. You can't rely on shareholders, remembering that around half of all shares held in Britain are now held overseas, and they change hands in a matter of months. You've got to look to workers who have that interest because their livelihoods depend on the long-term success of a company to have
Andy
a
Sylvester,
say.
has it effectively been a free-for-all for the bosses just to decide what they want to pay without any real checks?
I think a free-for-all is probably a bit strong, but there is a cultural issue in the city. There's no question about it. It's been like this for a long time, and corporate governance in the UK is a little bit like an oil tanker. It's going to take a long while to turn any direction we might want to.
Because I mean, just putting some statistics again on it, I mentioned how much the pay has grown. The average pay of CEOs of FTSE 100 companies was £1 million in 1998, £4.3 million in 2015. So when you look at figures like that, it does make clear what the picture has been.
Yeah, there are serious questions about whether pay and performance are still adequately linked. Now, I don't think we can, as a country, say that high pay in and of itself is a bad thing just because it's high pay. These are large companies employing lots of people. You need good people there. You need to compete on a global marketplace. But you do have to understand at those companies that they have to ensure the performance and the long term that Tom was talking about is considered when that pay is being set.
A 10% rise last year when their own workers were getting on average 2%.
That 10% number is a very misleading number, I think.
But these are clearly big pay rises at a time when workers lower down the scale have not been getting.
But actually, if you look at the evidence across all of this, there's no evidence that listed company senior executives are paid out of line with comparable positions, across the world, or actually for comparable high-skill occupations elsewhere. The reality is, we are facing up to, as a country, a broader economic phenomenon around inequality, and I wouldn't deny that that's a serious issue. But I think to sort of focus in that somehow it's just a problem with listed company CEO pay will actually lead to the wrong solution.
With workers, we used to call it leapfrogging. Why is it any different at the top? I mean, clearly, most people agree that top pay has got out of control. We need to rein it in. But also it leads to bad decisions because I'm afraid too many directors are looking at the short term and not the long term interests.
But I think that's a question of pay design. I think pay does need to be longer term. But I think we would absolutely agree with that. And I think that ultimately, companies are owned by shareholders, and international research shows that say-on pay regimes have been very effective in reforming pay practices.
Performance-related pay hasn't worked, has it?
I think there's been too much emphasis on performance-related pay based on short-term targets. I think we do need to make it longer term. We do need to make it simpler. I would agree with that. I think some of the sort of agency model view of the world has overemphasised it.
That's why we need a bit of common sense in the boardroom that I think workers can bring.
We've got a common sense sort of first step here from the government. In this Green Paper, we're proposing workers on remuneration committees and to be in the discussions around pay at the highest level. And I think that's a good, sensible first step. But we have to ensure that this is done in a way that training is available, that guidance is available, so that we don't just rush into this and create unintended consequences.
Let's bring in John O'Donoghue, because John O'Donoghue, you're a business manager at a software company, a software development company. Tell us how it works with your company.
Yes, indeed. I hear what people are saying, and as you said in the introduction, I agree in principle with the visibility and having the people on the board. But I think it's something that small business owners, are going to be sitting here. It's a different story for small business owners. Many of them have gone through many, poor times and are really invested heavily into their businesses. And so when they do get to turn a profit, I think that they should be allowed to take a good dividend from that. But saying that, I think it's also a culture. I mean, we work on with numerous companies that are looking to break down information silos. And I just see this as another part of that puzzle. I mean, for us as a small business, it's a whole culture of openness that we need to embrace. And for us, it's a unique selling point over the larger companies. And, we find that as a benefit for us, because if we're listening to our employees, then that means that we really are going to be listening to our customers as well. And that allows us to be more flexible.
What about the point, Francis, that Andy was raising about the fact that obviously there is competition, not just in this country, but in another country, for the people at the top. And if pay is capped too much, the the companies might lose out potentially.
On talent, yeah, that's another argument that doesn't stack up. I think a number of organisations, not just the TUC but the Independent High Pay Centre, have looked at that argument, and it clearly doesn't stand up, because many companies are in fact recruiting from Britain for their top positions, and we do end up in a sort of leapfrogging situation where somebody can always point to somebody else who's earning more. But I think a really important point made about small businesses and the relative power against big businesses. These proposals are about those big businesses that many people feel are not paying enough respect to their own workforces, or indeed small businesses down the supply chain, and too much money is lining the pockets of those at the top and not being invested in the skills and the kit and the equipment that we need to get Britain ready and fit, especially with Brexit on the horizon.
Thank you all very much. Thank you for joining us, and let us know your thoughts on that as well.
I've been getting away with